They had once fought for a chance to stand beside him, but when the room finally grew quiet, only one heart remained. The mansion overlooking the northern edge of Chicago had never looked more magnificent. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished marble floors, a string quartet played softly beneath a vaulted ceiling, and a dining table stretching nearly 40 feet had been prepared with extraordinary care. Every place setting gleamed beneath handcrafted silverware, fresh white roses filled elegant centerpieces, and a 3-tier birthday cake rested proudly at the center of the room beside a simple silver candle marked with the number 48. It was supposed to be the birthday celebration of Ethan Cole, a man whose name had once commanded respect wherever influential people gathered. Yet as the antique grandfather clock echoed 7 deliberate chimes through the enormous hall, every chair remained painfully empty. Ethan sat quietly in his wheelchair at the head of the table, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that had been selected days earlier for an occasion everyone had promised would become unforgettable. His posture remained dignified despite the paralysis that had confined him to the chair for nearly 3 years. His hands rested calmly upon the polished wooden armrests, while his eyes drifted toward the enormous front entrance each time the distant sound of an engine reached the driveway. Every few minutes, the butler glanced discreetly at his phone before lowering it again without speaking. Another cancellation. Another carefully worded apology. Business emergency. Family obligation. Unexpected travel. Weather concerns. Messages continued arriving one after another until eventually they stopped altogether. Silence became more honest than excuses. The musicians exchanged uncertain glances before quietly lowering their instruments. The chef stood inside the kitchen doorway, staring at dozens of untouched meals prepared with meticulous attention to every favorite dish Ethan had enjoyed since childhood. Prime rib rested beneath polished silver covers. Homemade mashed potatoes waited beside roasted vegetables. Fresh dinner rolls cooled gently beneath linen cloths. Everything had been planned for nearly 60 guests. There was only one guest left to serve. Ethan slowly smiled, though the expression carried no bitterness. It was the smile of someone who had already expected disappointment long before anyone else realized it. Outside, a light autumn breeze carried golden leaves across the long stone driveway leading toward the mansion. Luxury cars that had been expected never appeared. Security staff quietly dismissed extra parking attendants. Valet stations remained empty beneath decorative lanterns glowing against the evening sky. At exactly 7:38, gentle footsteps echoed through the otherwise silent entrance hall. Everyone turned instinctively. Naomi Brooks stood hesitantly near the front door, wearing her simple black housekeeping uniform neatly pressed as always. Her dark skin glowed warmly beneath the chandelier lights, and both hands carefully held a small gift wrapped in plain brown paper with a neatly tied blue ribbon. Compared to the expensive decorations surrounding her, the package looked almost insignificant. She lowered her eyes for a brief moment before gathering enough courage to step forward. "Happy birthday, Mr. Cole," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the distant music that had almost stopped playing. The enormous mansion fell completely silent. Ethan looked at the small package, then back toward Naomi. For the first time that evening, something genuine appeared inside his tired eyes. It was not surprise that someone had remembered his birthday. It was surprise that someone had chosen not to leave. 24 hours earlier, the mansion had been alive with quiet preparation instead of silence. Morning sunlight poured through towering windows, painting long golden lines across polished hardwood floors while employees moved carefully from room to room carrying flower arrangements, fresh linens, and carefully labeled boxes of decorations. Every detail had been planned weeks in advance because birthdays had once been the only occasion when Ethan Cole allowed business to disappear completely. Even after the accident that had confined him to a wheelchair, tradition mattered to him. He believed that as long as people gathered around one table, there was still something worth protecting. Naomi Brooks arrived before 6 o'clock that morning, just as she always did. Wearing her neatly pressed black housekeeping uniform, she quietly unlocked the service entrance and began dusting the grand staircase before anyone else appeared. She never hurried, yet every task seemed finished before others noticed it had begun. She replaced fresh flowers throughout the mansion, carefully polished family photographs displayed along the hallway, and paused for a brief moment while looking at a faded picture of Ethan standing beside his parents many years earlier. His smile had been effortless then, untouched by disappointment or loneliness. Naomi gently straightened the silver frame before continuing her work without saying a word. In the enormous kitchen, chefs discussed the evening menu while the head butler reviewed the guest list for what felt like the 10th time. More than 50 names remained neatly printed across expensive cream-colored stationery. Governors, business leaders, philanthropists, former associates, neighbors, and longtime acquaintances had all confirmed their attendance. At least they had the week before. Shortly after 8 o'clock, the butler's phone vibrated. He glanced at the message and frowned almost imperceptibly before quietly marking a red line through the first name. 10 minutes later, another notification arrived. Then another. By lunchtime, nearly one-third of the guest list had withdrawn with carefully written apologies that all sounded strangely alike.
Urgent meeting.
Unexpected travel. Family responsibilities. Scheduling conflicts. No one mentioned Ethan directly. No one admitted the uncomfortable truth that the powerful man they once admired no longer offered the influence he once had. The conversations among the staff gradually changed. Some whispered that perhaps the weather would improve attendance. Others avoided discussing the growing number of empty seats altogether. Only Naomi continued preparing the dining room exactly as planned. She counted every plate twice, folded every linen napkin with patient precision, adjusted every chair until they stood perfectly aligned, and arranged each place setting as though every invited guest would certainly arrive. During the afternoon, the estate manager passed through the dining hall and quietly laughed when he noticed Naomi checking the centerpiece for the 3rd time. "You are putting too much effort into a party that will probably end early," he remarked with a shrug. Several kitchen employees exchanged uncomfortable smiles, but said nothing. Naomi simply looked toward the long table and answered gently, "Someone should still make it beautiful." The manager shook his head as though he could not understand such thinking before walking away. Upstairs, Ethan spent part of the afternoon reading beside the library window. From where she polished the hallway railing, Naomi occasionally noticed him gazing toward the front driveway with calm expectation. He never asked how many guests had canceled. He never questioned why conversations became quieter whenever he entered a room. He simply trusted that those who had promised to come would keep their word. Naomi lowered her eyes and continued working, carrying a silent hope that at least one promise in that house would remain unbroken before the day was over. By late afternoon, the mansion had become a place where polished perfection quietly concealed growing emptiness. Every elegant room reflected careful preparation, yet an invisible weight seemed to settle over the estate with each passing hour. Ethan Cole noticed it long before anyone dared to mention it aloud. He had spent enough years understanding people to recognize that silence often revealed more than words ever could. Sitting beside the wide living room windows, he watched autumn leaves drift across the stone courtyard while sunlight slowly faded behind the tall oak trees surrounding the property. Once, the long driveway outside had rarely remained empty for more than a few minutes. Visitors arrived constantly, bringing invitations, proposals, congratulations, or simply hoping to spend a few moments in the company of a man whose approval carried tremendous influence. Now, the only vehicles entering the gates belonged to delivery companies bringing flowers ordered weeks earlier or employees arriving to complete another ordinary workday. Ethan never complained. His expression remained composed, almost peaceful, but those who looked carefully could see that every glance toward the entrance lasted a little longer than the one before. Downstairs, Naomi Brooks continued moving quietly through the mansion with the same steady rhythm she had followed since the day she first accepted the housekeeping position nearly 4 years earlier. She dusted bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, refreshed fresh flowers throughout the hallways, polished crystal glassware until every piece reflected the evening light, and carefully inspected each dining chair one final time. Her work was never hurried because she believed respect could be shown through the smallest details. Some employees admired her dedication, while others simply considered her overly serious. As preparations continued, conversations among the staff became increasingly uncomfortable. The pastry chef glanced toward the untouched birthday cake before whispering that perhaps they should store part of it in the kitchen refrigerator. A server quietly suggested removing several place settings from the table to avoid making the empty seats so obvious. The head butler rejected the idea immediately. Everything would remain exactly as planned unless Mr. Cole personally requested otherwise. Naomi silently agreed. She gently straightened one slightly crooked napkin and continued arranging the silverware with patient precision. Near the service entrance, the estate manager spoke with a delivery driver before shaking his head in quiet disbelief. More cancellation messages had arrived during the afternoon. Several guests who had once insisted they would never miss Ethan's birthday had suddenly discovered reasons to stay away. None of those explanations sounded convincing. Everyone inside the mansion understood what was happening, yet no one wished to become the first person to say it aloud. Influence had faded, and with it had disappeared many relationships that had never truly been friendships. Naomi carried fresh coffee to Ethan just before sunset. He accepted the cup with a warm smile and thanked her by name, something he always did regardless of how busy the day became. She noticed the untouched guest list resting on the side table beside him. A few names had been crossed out in neat red ink, but many remained, offering one final reason to hope. Ethan looked toward the glowing horizon and said quietly, almost to himself, "Sometimes people simply become busy." Naomi hesitated before answering with gentle honesty. "Sometimes they do, but sometimes the people who matter arrive later than everyone expects." Ethan looked at her for a moment, surprised by the quiet confidence hidden beneath her usual shyness. Then he smiled again, this time with a little more warmth than before, while outside the first evening lights slowly illuminated a driveway that was still waiting for someone to come home. As darkness settled gently beyond the mansion windows, the last traces of hope seemed to disappear with a fading daylight. The elegant dining room remained exactly as Naomi Brooks had prepared it, every candle glowing softly, every crystal glass catching warm reflections, every chair waiting patiently for guests who never came. The string quartet had quietly packed away their instruments after receiving a respectful nod from the head butler, leaving only the distant ticking of the grandfather clock to fill the silence. Ethan Cole sat at the head of the long table, his composed expression unchanged even as another message appeared on the butler's phone. The older man hesitated before slipping the device into his pocket without saying a word. He no longer needed to. The absence of arriving cars outside had already spoken clearly enough. One by one, the kitchen staff began clearing serving trays before stopping halfway through the task, uncertain whether ending the celebration would feel more painful than pretending it still existed. Ethan noticed their hesitation and offered a gentle smile that carried neither anger nor disappointment. "Please do not let good food go to waste," he said calmly. "Everyone has worked too hard today." His kindness only made the room feel quieter. Naomi remained standing near the doorway, still holding the small brown package she had wrapped herself the night before. She had planned to leave it quietly on the gift table beside the expensive presents she expected everyone else to bring. Now the enormous table stood almost empty except for floral arrangements and a single birthday cake waiting beneath flickering candlelight. She lowered her eyes for a moment before taking a slow breath. The estate manager whispered to another employee that perhaps they should finish for the evening, but Naomi gently interrupted. "Would you mind leaving the kitchen open for a little longer?" she asked politely. Several surprised faces turned toward her. "I would like to prepare one more dinner." The manager looked confused. "Everything is already prepared." Naomi smiled softly. "Not this one." Without waiting for recognition, she quietly walked into the kitchen and tied a simple white apron over her uniform. Instead of choosing the luxurious dishes that had filled the banquet menu, she searched through smaller ingredients tucked away on lower shelves. Fresh vegetables, homemade broth, warm bread, roasted chicken, herbs from the garden, and apples waiting beside the pantry window. She worked carefully and patiently, moving with quiet confidence that surprised even the experienced chefs watching nearby. Nobody offered instructions because none seemed necessary. Every movement carried the certainty of someone cooking from memory instead of following recipes. Upstairs, Ethan remained alone beside the candlelit table until a gentle aroma drifted through the mansion. It was warm, comforting, and strangely familiar. Not the rich scent of a formal banquet, but the welcoming fragrance of a family meal prepared with genuine affection. Curious, he guided his wheelchair toward the dining room entrance, just as Naomi emerged carrying a simple tray. There was homemade chicken soup served in a porcelain bowl, slices of warm bread wrapped in linen, roasted apples sprinkled lightly with cinnamon, and a small cup of tea releasing delicate curls of steam. She placed everything before him with quiet care before setting the little brown package beside the plate. "I know it is not a grand celebration," she said softly, meeting his eyes with gentle sincerity, "but I hope tonight could still feel like home." For several long seconds, Ethan simply looked at the meal before him. The mansion remained silent, yet the emptiness that had filled every room throughout the evening no longer felt quite as overwhelming, because for the first time that day, someone had given him something no invitation or expensive gift ever could: the feeling that he had not been forgotten. The warm meal remained untouched for several quiet moments as Ethan Cole looked at the simple dishes resting before him. Nothing on the tray resembled the extravagant menu that had filled the mansion's kitchen only hours earlier, yet every familiar aroma carried him somewhere far beyond the enormous dining room. He slowly lifted the spoon, tasted the soup, and closed his eyes for a brief instant. The flavor was gentle, comforting, and unmistakably familiar. It reminded him of rainy afternoons from his childhood, when his mother insisted that every problem in the world seemed smaller after a warm meal shared around the family table. A faint smile appeared across his face, softer than any expression the staff had seen in years. Naomi Brooks stood quietly several feet away, uncertain whether she should remain or excuse herself. Before she could step back, Ethan looked toward her and spoke with quiet sincerity. "This tastes exactly the way my mother used to make it." Naomi lowered her eyes with a shy smile. "I hoped it would." The words lingered in the room with unexpected weight. Ethan studied her face, surprised by the confidence hidden beneath her gentle voice. "How could you possibly know that?" he asked. Naomi hesitated, carefully choosing her words before answering. "When I first started working here, I found one of the old household notebooks while organizing the library. It was filled with handwritten recipes, grocery lists, and little notes your mother left for the kitchen staff many years ago. I copied a few recipes because they reminded me of the meals my own mother used to cook." Ethan looked toward the nearby bookshelf as memories quietly returned. He had almost forgotten about those notebooks. His mother had written everything by hand, believing recipes carried stories that should never disappear. Naomi gently reached into the pocket of her apron and unfolded a carefully protected sheet of paper that had clearly been read many times. The handwriting had faded slightly with age, but every line remained elegant and deliberate. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was his mother's writing. Naomi placed it beside the bowl without seeking attention. "I thought it belonged with you tonight," she said softly. Ethan ran his fingertips carefully across the familiar handwriting, his expression changing from surprise to quiet reflection. Around them, the staff had gradually stopped pretending to work. The head butler stood silently near the doorway, while several kitchen employees watched from a respectful distance, witnessing a side of their employer few had ever seen. The mansion no longer felt like the residence of a powerful man abandoned by former associates. Instead, it felt like a family home remembering its own history. After finishing the meal, Ethan finally noticed the small brown package Naomi had placed beside his plate. He untied the simple blue ribbon with careful hands and opened the wrapping slowly. Inside rested an old wooden picture frame that had been lovingly restored. Behind the polished glass was a faded photograph of Ethan as a young boy standing between his parents beneath a flowering cherry tree, all three smiling with effortless happiness. The frame itself showed signs of careful repair where tiny cracks had once appeared, each restored so skillfully that they were almost invisible. Naomi spoke quietly, almost apologetically. It had been stored in the attic for many years. "I thought memories should not stay hidden in boxes." Ethan held the photograph against the warm candlelight, unable to look away. Expensive gifts could have filled the room that evening, but none would have carried the quiet devotion resting inside his hands. In that simple restored frame, he saw not only the family he had almost lost to time, but also the extraordinary kindness of the one person who had chosen to preserve it when everyone else had forgotten. The restored photograph remained in Ethan Cole's hands long after the candles had burned lower, as though letting go of it would mean watching those precious memories disappear once again. He carefully traced the smiling faces with his fingertips before looking toward Naomi Brooks, who still stood quietly beside the table with the same humility she had carried since the day she first entered the mansion. There was no expectation in her expression, no hope for praise, only quiet contentment that she had managed to bring a little comfort into an evening that had begun with so much loneliness. Ethan finally broke the silence with a question that had settled in his heart since tasting the homemade soup. "Naomi, why have you always cared so much about this house?" She hesitated for only a moment before gently taking a seat several feet away after he invited her to do so. The staff discreetly withdrew, leaving the two of them alone beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. Naomi folded her hands in her lap and spoke with the same calm honesty that had guided every action she had taken throughout the evening. "There is something I have wanted to tell you for a very long time, but I never believed this moment belonged to me." Ethan listened without interrupting. Naomi smiled faintly, as though revisiting memories she had protected for years. "When I was 8 years old, my mother lost her job. We had nowhere to live for several months. I was too young to understand why everything changed so quickly, but I remember sleeping inside an old church shelter and pretending it was an adventure, so my mother would not cry." She paused before continuing. "One winter afternoon, someone paid every outstanding bill that my mother could not afford. They arranged a small apartment, groceries for several months, and helped her find steady work again. We never met the person responsible. My mother only knew the help came quietly through a charitable foundation supported by her parents." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. He remembered that foundation. His mother had insisted that every act of generosity remain anonymous, because she believed gratitude should never become a public performance. Naomi continued softly. "My mother kept every letter they sent. She told me that somewhere in this city, there were people who believed strangers deserved kindness even when nobody was watching. She made me promise that if life ever allowed me to repay that kindness, I would never hesitate." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the restored photograph resting on the table. Suddenly, the evening felt connected by invisible threads stretching back decades. Naomi smiled gently. "Years later, when I learned this mansion was hiring, I recognized your family name immediately. I applied because I wanted to honor the promise I made as a little girl. I never expected anyone to remember me. I never wanted anyone to know." Ethan remained silent for several moments, overwhelmed not by the revelation itself, but by its extraordinary simplicity. Every polished floor, every carefully restored photograph, every warm meal, every small act of thoughtfulness had never been ordinary housekeeping. They had all been quiet expressions of gratitude carried faithfully across 20 years. He looked toward Naomi with eyes filled not with sympathy, but with profound respect. For the first time in many years, Ethan realized that while countless people had once remained beside him because of influence, the shy woman sitting across the table had remained for a reason far stronger. She had stayed because kindness, once received with a grateful heart, had quietly become the foundation of her entire life. The quiet warmth that had settled over the mansion was interrupted by the distant sound of tires rolling slowly across the long stone driveway. It was nearly 9 o'clock when bright headlights swept across the front windows, followed by another pair only moments later. The head butler instinctively glanced toward the entrance, while several employees exchanged uncertain looks. After hours of empty silence, the guests had finally decided to arrive. Expensive cars came to a graceful stop beneath the covered entrance, and elegantly dressed men and women stepped onto the polished stone walkway carrying beautifully wrapped gifts. Elaborate floral arrangements and carefully rehearsed smiles They laughed politely among themselves as though nothing unusual had happened, convinced that arriving fashionably late would erase hours of absence. Inside the dining room, Ethan Cole quietly looked toward the front doors without changing his expression. The disappointment he had carried throughout the evening had already transformed into something calmer and far more meaningful. He was no longer waiting for anyone. Naomi Brooks gently reached for the serving tray, intending to clear the dishes before the unexpected visitors entered, but Ethan softly raised one hand. "Please leave everything exactly as it is," he said. His voice remained warm, yet it carried a quiet certainty that immediately caught everyone's attention. Moments later, the massive front doors opened. One after another, the late guests entered the grand foyer with practiced enthusiasm. They apologized for impossible traffic, delayed meetings, unexpected flights, and urgent obligations. Some spoke loudly about how determined they had been to make it before the evening ended, while others proudly handed expensive gifts to waiting staff members, without realizing the celebration had already found its true purpose. The estate manager hurried forward to welcome them, but Ethan calmly asked him to wait. Every conversation faded into silence. The guests finally noticed the nearly untouched banquet table, the extinguished candles, and the simple homemade meals still resting before Ethan. They also noticed Naomi standing quietly beside him with her modest black housekeeping uniform and the small brown wrapping paper folded neatly on the table. Their confident smiles slowly disappeared. Ethan looked across the room with remarkable composure before speaking in a gentle voice that echoed naturally through the silent dining hall. "Thank you for coming," he began. "I truly appreciate the effort it took to be here." Several guests relaxed, believing the uncomfortable moment had already passed. Then Ethan continued. "Unfortunately, the birthday celebration ended hours ago. A few people attempted to apologize again, but he politely lifted his hand. There is no need to explain. Life becomes busy. Plans change. I understand that." His calm words carried no accusation, making them even more difficult to answer. He slowly turned toward Naomi and smiled with genuine gratitude. "This evening, I discovered that one person who sincerely wishes to spend time with you is worth more than a room filled with people who simply wish to be seen beside you." The room became completely still. Naomi lowered her eyes, visibly embarrassed by the unexpected attention, while the guests silently looked at one another, unsure where to rest their gaze. Ethan then surprised everyone once more. "Please enjoy the flowers and allow the gifts to be donated to the community center my parents once supported. Tonight, I would rather finish my dinner with the person who made certain I never celebrated alone." No one argued. No one protested. One by one, the visitors quietly lowered the presents they had brought before turning toward the entrance again. As the front doors gently closed behind the last departing guest, the enormous mansion no longer felt empty. For the first time that evening, it felt honest. The mansion settled into a peaceful silence, unlike any it had known in years. The grand entrance stood closed once again, but this time the quiet no longer carried disappointment. Instead, it felt like the calm that follows a long overdue truth. Ethan Cole looked around the dining room where dozens of untouched chairs still surrounded the table. Hours earlier, those empty seats had reminded him of everything he had lost. Now they reminded him of something entirely different. They had revealed who truly belonged there. Naomi Brooks quietly gathered several dishes from the table, believing the evening had finally come to an end. She moved with the same modest grace she always had, careful not to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. Before she could carry the tray toward the kitchen, Ethan spoke gently. "Naomi, would you please sit down for a little longer?" She looked surprised. "There is still cleaning to finish, Mr. Cole." He smiled warmly. "The cleaning can wait." Some moments should not. She hesitated before slowly returning to the chair nearest his own, sitting carefully as though she still believed she had not earned the right to remain at the table. Ethan folded his hands together and looked toward the head butler, who had quietly remained nearby throughout the evening. "Would you please ask everyone who is still working tonight to join us for a few minutes?" The request caught everyone by surprise. Within moments, the chefs, servers, housekeepers, gardeners, maintenance workers, security personnel, and office staff gradually entered the dining room. Many stood respectfully along the walls, uncertain why they had been called together so late in the evening. Ethan looked at each familiar face before speaking with calm sincerity. For many years, I believed loyalty could be measured by how many people stood beside me when life was easy. Tonight, I learned how mistaken I was. His eyes gently turned toward Naomi. The person who showed me the greatest kindness was not someone seeking recognition, influence, or reward. She simply chose to remain when remaining was the hardest decision. Naomi lowered her head, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Ethan continued before she could quietly disappear into the background once again. Beginning tomorrow, Naomi Brooks will no longer be introduced as simply the maid of this house. She has my complete trust, and she will serve as the household director, overseeing every member of the estate staff with the same kindness and integrity she has shown every single day. A wave of astonishment spread through the room, followed almost immediately by genuine smiles. The head butler was the first to applaud softly. One by one, every employee joined him until the elegant dining hall filled with warm, heartfelt applause. Naomi looked overwhelmed. "Mr. Cole, I never wanted anything in return," she whispered. Ethan nodded gently. "I know. That is exactly why you deserve it." The applause gradually faded into quiet laughter as several longtime employees stepped forward to congratulate her. Even the estate manager, who had once dismissed her careful preparations, offered a sincere apology. "I judged you far too quickly," he admitted with honest regret. Naomi accepted his words with a gracious smile, holding no bitterness in her heart. The chefs returned to the kitchen and soon reappeared carrying fresh slices of birthday cake. This time there were no assigned seats, no formal arrangements, and no concern for appearances. Everyone gathered naturally around the table, sharing stories, laughter, warm tea, and simple conversation. Ethan listened more than he spoke, watching the people around him with quiet gratitude. The mansion had not become full because influential guests had finally arrived. It had become full because the people who truly cared had finally been invited to sit together as equals, and for the first time in many years, the house felt exactly the way his parents had always hoped it would feel, like home. 1 year later, the mansion looked almost exactly as it had the previous autumn, yet everything that truly mattered had changed. Golden leaves once again drifted across the long stone driveway, warm afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows, and the dining room had been carefully prepared for another birthday celebration. The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, fresh white roses filled the center of the long table, and laughter quietly echoed through the halls long before the first meal was served. This time, however, no one waited anxiously for expensive cars or important names. There was no guest list measured by influence, no concern over social status, and no expectation that appearances mattered more than sincerity. The people arriving that afternoon were neighbors, longtime employees, volunteers from the community center supported by Ethan Cole's family, elderly residents from a nearby retirement home, children whose educational programs had been funded through the charitable foundation, and ordinary families whose lives had quietly been touched by simple acts of kindness. They came carrying homemade desserts, handwritten birthday cards, family photographs, and warm smiles instead of extravagant gifts. Every greeting felt genuine because every person had chosen to be there. Ethan waited near the head of the table in his wheelchair, wearing another perfectly tailored charcoal suit, but there was something noticeably lighter about him. His smile appeared more often, his eyes no longer searched the doorway with quiet uncertainty, and the loneliness that had once settled around him like an invisible shadow had gradually disappeared. Beside him, Naomi Brooks welcomed every guest with the same quiet grace she had always shown. Although she now directed the entire household staff, very little about her daily life had changed. She still greeted employees by name every morning, still helped carry trays whenever the kitchen became busy, still polished family photographs with careful hands, and still believed that every small detail deserved the same respect as the largest responsibility. Her title had changed, but her heart had not. Throughout the afternoon, Ethan watched children laughing in the gardens where silence had once lingered, volunteers sharing stories with longtime employees, and neighbors treating the mansion as though it had always been a place where everyone belonged. At one point, the head butler quietly approached Ethan and smiled. "The dining room is completely full, sir." Ethan looked around before answering with gentle gratitude. "No," he replied softly. "The dining room is finally complete." As dinner came to an end, Ethan slowly lifted a glass of sparkling cider. The conversations gradually faded as every face turned toward him. He looked first at Naomi before letting his eyes travel across the room filled with familiar, grateful faces. "Last year," he said quietly, "I believed I had lost almost everything that mattered. Instead, I discovered something I had overlooked for far too long. Real family is not determined by power, wealth, or the number of people who know your name. Real family is revealed by the people who choose to remain when there is nothing to gain except the chance to care for another human being." The room remained completely silent, not because anyone lacked words, but because every person understood the truth behind them. Ethan gently raised his glass toward Naomi, and everyone else instinctively followed. She smiled shyly, her eyes glistening with quiet emotion, still uncomfortable being recognized, yet deeply grateful to share the moment with those around her. Outside, the evening sky slowly filled with the warm colors of sunset as laughter returned to the gardens and music drifted gently through the open windows. The mansion no longer stood as a monument to influence or forgotten promises. It had become a home where kindness was remembered, loyalty was honored, and every person was welcomed with dignity. And that day, everyone remembered that the greatest gift is never wrapped in paper, but carried faithfully by a heart that chooses to stay when everyone else quietly walks away.